Unfortunately for Native America, the De Soto expedition and the Spanish expeditions that followed left behind a legacy even more destructive than that of cruelty, murder, and greed. A legacy that would wreak havoc among the chiefdoms of the southeastern Indians, including those in Appalachia.
An exotic species is a species that naturally lives elsewhere and either on its own or by human transport arrives in the place that you're interested in. So it's a species of plant or animal or microbe that is new and may not have predators and may not have any constraints that naturally limit it. It's able to take off and explode.
Viruses that had evolved in high-density European populations were suddenly introduced into groups of Native Americans having little, if any, resistance. Diseases such as measles, chickenpox, influenza, and smallpox wreaked havoc among the tribes of Appalachia and the Southeast, and during the next century, more than half the native population perished. Entire tribes vanished. Social systems collapsed. Mound building came to an abrupt end.
Everyone agrees that the impact of disease was something that modern people simply cannot imagine. Diseases did not hit everyone equally. Disease tended to kill the very old and the very young disproportionately. What this meant was that European diseases robbed the native people of their past.
They were pre-literate societies. They didn't have a writing system, so all of their knowledge was in people's heads. And as the people died, so did the knowledge.
Many tribes became refugees in their own land. Others disappeared altogether. They include the Saponi, the Eno, the Sugaree, the Cherokee, the Coasati, the Yuchi, the Napoche, the Alabama, the Yadkin, the Occaneechi, the Oconee, the Congaree, the Wateree, the Waxhaw, the Shawnana, the Kiawe, the Tutelo, the PD, the Coosa. Names that now are only whispers and legends. One name, however, acquired an entirely new significance due to a comedy of errors and the almost magical powers of map-making.
Appalachia got its name from the Appalachian chieftain, which was a particular society of Indians. The capital was in what is now Tallahassee, Florida, fairly small, discrete territory in northern Florida. When the French Huguenots got to the Florida coast, they heard that these Appalachian Indians had gold. So the French assumed that Appalachia also included the mountains themselves. They didn't really know who lived where. So in this way, the name of the Appalachian Indians got transferred to the Appalachian Mountains by this misunderstanding on the part of French Huguenots in the 1560s.
Thus did the name Appalachia enter into recorded history, a place of mountains, a place of Indians, a place of wilderness, a place of treasure, a place beyond the edges of the known world. And except in the imaginative map-making studios of Germany, Holland, and France, no European would re-enter Appalachia for nearly a century. When the door opened again in the late 1600s, it was an altered landscape.
We're called AHistory2. AHistory2 is, and that means the Cherokee people.
And the Cherokees lived in the vicinity of what are now called North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia. Not the whole states, but those where they came together, and this was Cherokee territory.
For a century after the conquistadors departed, Native Americans struggled to recover and reorganize. At the end of the 17th century, the Confederation of the Iroquois dominated the northern mountains, whereas in central Appalachia, the Shawnee and the Miami were predominant. And in southern Appalachia, protected by the high mountains from the worst of the early epidemics, the Cherokee Nation emerged as the principal tribe.
For the Cherokee and for a lot of indigenous people, mountains are nurturing places and places where they're protected. They're sacred in many cultures because they're literally sources of life, because life-giving waters come from them. There's a Cherokee elder, Jerry Wolf, who talks about how the mountains are sacred to us as the Cherokee, and the mountains take care of us and we take care of them, and there's a reciprocal arrangement.
And all of the mountain peaks we see, and particularly this one behind me, Whiteside Mountain, but just about all of the major mountains were sacred mountains, and there are legends that the Cherokees had about these mountains.
That spirits lived in the mountains, and that the wonderful story about the animals and the plants.
And it was told to me by my relatives as I was growing up. Said in the very early days that the Cherokees began to make blowguns and bows and arrows and spears. And they began to kill the animals in abundance and without appreciation. And they continued to the point that the animals were almost annihilated. But the animals decided they were going to come back and go to war against man.
The animals hold a congress, and they decide what they're going to do about men, because men are encroaching upon them. They're taking up their living space.
And so the old bear was chief of the animal tribe, and so he decided to make bows and arrows and spears, and he was going to do to man what they were doing to them. But the problem was the animals couldn't use those weapons. And the old bear tried to shoot the bow and arrow, but he kept cutting the string with his claws. And
finally, the bears just kind of shrugged their shoulders, and they sort of walk off without taking revenge.
But the little smaller animals just continued on, and the insects, and they decided to go out in the forest and gather diseases. And so they went out and they gathered such things as rabies, and then the mosquitoes got the malaria, and the ticks picked up diseases, and all these creatures began to bring the diseases into men, and the man began to die.
But then the plants came along and said, well, they like the people.
All of a sudden, the Great Spirit felt sorry for man, and so he talked to the plant world, and he told the plants to invent a cure for all those diseases that the animals had found.
Like the sassafras. When you get a stain, and all you got to do is get those fresh leaves and just rub them up together and then let the juice from those leaves.
Of course, one of the great things that the first settlers here discovered was some of the ways that the Cherokees used those plants to heal. And I think that just that myth itself gives you a sense that the animals, the plants, the human beings, all were associated in their mind.
3 things held the Cherokee people together: common beliefs, a common language, and a kinship system based on the 7 clans.
One was a bird, another's a deer, of which I'm a member of, the Blue Clan, the Paint Clan, the Long Hair, the Wolf Clan, and the Wild Potato. And we get our clans from our mothers.
The 42 towns of the Cherokee Nation lay in the shadows of the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Great Smokies, and along the river they called the Long Man. 300 miles to the east, tiny European settlements were taking a firm hold along the coast, and by the end of the 17th century, white visitors were again showing up in Cherokee territory.
I think if you walked into a Cherokee village in 1700, that you would find people who were enormously hospitable. Hospitality was a social virtue, and Cherokees were very welcoming. They would have brought you into the town square. You would have seen little kitchen gardens close to the households, but surrounding the village, you would have seen large fields of corn and beans. Cherokee households had a sense of owning a section of the common field. On the other hand, labor was communal, and Cherokee women moved from field to field, working together, singing their corn songs, caring for their children, in a kind of community of women.
But I'm sure with the early whites coming into the Cherokee country, I'm sure they wondered why they were so light-skinned, you know. If I were living back then, I'd wonder why. Of course, the early white people were traders that came in. And Cherokees adapted very well. They needed the metal pots and pans the hoes, different things like shovels, things that they had. Women like nice looking clothing, and I'm sure the women accepted the bright ribbons and the bright clothing that was coming in. They started adapting to those things very quickly.
Trade was nothing new for the Indians. A vast network of trading paths had connected Appalachia with both the Gulf Coast and the Great Lakes for centuries. In the early 18th century, however, Cherokees and other Appalachian tribes became increasingly drawn into a world market economy centered in Europe. The Cherokees became one of the key producers for this economy, and what they produced was deerskins.
The effect on Indian life of the deerskin trade was that all of their labor got absorbed into it. I mean, you had to kill the deer, you had to go out and kill it, you had to skin it, you had to have somebody to process the hide, treat it with the deer brain process to soften it up, and you then traded this into Charleston. And at its peak, hundreds of thousands of deerskin a year would be shipped through Charleston. This was shipped to Europe and used for all sorts of purposes. They made men's trousers out of them. They made aprons. They made gloves. They made book bindings. There was a vast market for leather of all sorts in Europe at the time.
And deerskins become the currency of the Indian trade. Cherokee hunters produced hundreds of thousands of deerskins.
The traders would get their merchandise on credit. They'd go up into the interior. They would trade them to the Indians, who would promise to go out and kill so many deer a year. And then if everything worked back, everybody got paid along the line. But more and more the Indians would fall into debt.
What Cherokees received in return were European manufactured goods. They received cloth. They received metal tools, scissors, knives, hatchets, hoes, metal kettles. They received decorative items, mirrors, beads. Most importantly, however, they received guns and ammunition.
They loved guns because that made it easier. And so they quickly adapted to that. But it, in essence, led to some of the seeds that planted the seeds of their destruction in a way. Because with guns and with the European demand for furs, they wiped out the deer populations in this area. They wiped out the beaver populations in this area. The Native Americans did.
Once the gun was put into the equation, the gun couldn't be taken out. In other words, however they might not wish to have guns, they had to have guns.
By 1720, all of the Native American tribes in Appalachia were armed with guns, and the white-tailed deer, which had been central to the Cherokee way of life for centuries, was becoming harder and harder to find.
Cherokees began to produce fewer of their own commodities, and so many of the skills that Cherokees had honed over centuries began to wane. Things like pottery making, for example. Why make a clay pot when you can buy a kettle from the trader?
Also, it changed the social structure. You had different traders who married in with the Cherokee women, and the matrilineal ideas of the man moving in with the woman changed. The woman started moving in with the man.
For Indians, the fur trade became an outward manifestation of a larger alliance between cultures, which reached a new plateau with the strange, brash, completely unauthorized visit of Sir Alexander Cumming to the Cherokee Nation in April of the year 1730. Something of a showman and a confidence man, Sir Alex convinced the Cherokee to pledge their allegiance to King George of England in return for the king's undying care. To cement the bond, Sir Alex convinced 7 Cherokee warriors to immediately board ship and go see the king.
He was just a flamboyant character. I think he's one of these people that maybe didn't even think about a mercenary reward as much as he did that this would just be an interesting thing to do. So he took them back to London with him, and this just became a great event to see these Native Americans, to go and visit them. They were taken to the opera. Some of the women, it was said, the British women really fell in love with some of these good-looking young people. King George entertained them. It was written up in the London papers. It was just a great event. and Attakulla, who became one of the great